Leon Hawthorne barely glanced up from his phone as he stepped into the opulent private dining room of the five-star restaurant. This last-minute business dinner had been forced onto his schedule, and he was already irritated. He had planned to be on his jet by now, heading to his private estate in the south of France, not sitting through another tedious corporate negotiation. The maitre d' led him to the table where his business associate, Richard Caldwell, was already seated. But it wasn't Richard who made Leon pause mid-step. It was the woman sitting across from him. She had long, dark waves cascading over her shoulders and striking amber eyes that locked onto his with quiet confidence. Dressed in an elegant but understated navy dress, she wasn't dripping in diamonds like the women who usually surrounded him at high-profile events. No, she was different, refreshing, even. Richard stood, shaking Leon's hand. "Leon, glad you could make it. This is my niece, Rowan Sinclair. She's in town for a few weeks, and I thought she'd enjoy a proper business dinner." Rowan offered a polite smile. "I hope you don't mind me tagging along." Leon slid into his chair, his gaze lingering on her for a fraction longer than necessary. "Not at all." The conversation started as expected discussions of mergers, market trends, and investment opportunities, but Leon found himself more interested in Rowan. She listened intently, occasionally offering sharp observations that caught him off guard. "You know," she said, swirling her wine glass, "for someone as powerful as you, Mr. Hawthorne, I expected a more decisive stance on global expansion." Leon arched a brow. "Is that so?" Rowan nodded, completely unfazed by the weight of his presence. "You have the capital and the influence, but from what I've read, you hesitate in certain markets. Playing it safe isn't always smart." Richard chuckled, clearly amused. "Rowan has a habit of speaking her mind." Leon studied her, intrigued. Most people either feared him or tried to impress him. Rowan did neither. "And what do you do, Miss Sinclair?" "I work in nonprofit development." He leaned back, assessing her. "A sharp mind like yours in the nonprofit sector. You could make a fortune in corporate strategy." She grinned. "Money isn't everything, Mr. Hawthorne." Leon had heard that before from people who had never experienced the power that wealth provided. But with her, it didn't sound naive. It sounded like conviction. As the dinner went on, Leon found himself drawn into her world. She spoke passionately about her work, about helping others, about making real change. And for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about profit margins or stock values, he was thinking about her. By the time dessert arrived, Richard excused himself to take a call, leaving Leon and Rowan alone. "You did that on purpose," Rowan said, tilting her head toward her uncle's empty seat. Leon smirked. "Maybe." She shook her head, laughing softly. "You're used to getting your way, aren't you?" "I don't believe in wasting time," he admitted. "And I don't believe in ignoring what's right in front of me." Her smile faltered slightly, as if she wasn't sure how to respond. Finally, she set down her fork and met his gaze. "You're a fascinating man, Leon Hawthorne. And you're unlike anyone I've ever met." For the first time in years, Leon felt something stir inside him, something unexpected, something dangerous. He wanted more. And Leon Hawthorne always got what he wanted. Leon Hawthorne wasn't a man who lingered on thoughts of anyone. His world was built on precision, and control. Emotions were distractions, attachments liabilities. But as he stepped out of the restaurant and into the backseat of his Blacktown car, he caught himself replaying the evening, every sharp remark Rowan Sinclair had thrown his way, every flicker of intrigue in her gaze. She had been unexpected. The city lights blurred past as his driver maneuvered through the streets. His phone buzzed against his palm, but he ignored it. His mind was elsewhere, drawn to the way Rowan had held her own in a room where most people carefully curated their words around him. She hadn't done that. She had spoken with conviction, challenged him without hesitation, and that was dangerous. Leon had long learned that the people who intrigued him the most were often the ones who could unravel him. By the time he stepped into the penthouse of his high rise, he had convinced himself that it was nothing more than a passing interest, a fleeting spark, nothing worth examining. Yet the following afternoon, when his assistant rattled off his schedule, he found himself interrupting. "Find out where Rowan Sinclair is staying." There was a brief pause before his assistant responded with a clipped acknowledgement, not daring to question him. Leon didn't pursue things people pursued him, but this was different. He wasn't used to wanting something without a clear end game, and that unsettled him. Later that evening, he found himself at a private event hosted by one of his business partners. The ballroom was a spectacle: crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, champagne glasses in every hand. The usual crowd of executives and socialites mingled, exchanging pleasantries that held no real weight. Leon was halfway through a conversation about an upcoming acquisition when something shifted in the air. Rowan was there. She stood near one of the grand windows, speaking with a woman he vaguely recognized as a philanthropist. Her dark hair was swept into a low chignon, and the deep emerald of her dress complemented the richness of her gaze. Leon excused himself from his conversation without a second thought. Rowan noticed him before he reached her. He saw the flicker of recognition, the slight tilt of her chin, as if preparing herself for whatever was coming next. "You're following me now?" she asked, her voice laced with amusement as he approached. "Coincidence," he replied smoothly. She didn't look convinced. "Do you attend every major event in the city?" she asked. "Only the ones worth my time." Her lips pressed together as if debating whether to engage further. Then, with a sigh, she conceded. "Fine," she said. "Let's pretend this is just coincidence. What exactly does Leon Hawthorne do at these events? Scout for new business ventures? Or is it more about reminding everyone that you're always 3 steps ahead?" He studied her, the way she wasn't intimidated by his presence, the way she challenged him with every sentence. "Maybe I enjoy the company," he said. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You don't strike me as someone who enjoys much of anything outside of work." His mouth curved slightly. "And what do I strike you as?" She hesitated, as if considering whether to tell him the truth. But something flickered in her expression: curiosity, perhaps. "Someone who doesn't let people in," she said finally. Leon wasn't sure why that landed deeper than it should have. He had spent years perfecting the art of keeping people at arm's length, ensuring that no one got close enough to see the cracks beneath the surface. Yet, standing in front of Rowan, he had the strangest feeling that she saw them anyway. Before he could respond, someone called her name from across the room. She glanced over her shoulder, then back at him. "I should go," she said. Leon wasn't used to people walking away from him, but he let her go anyway, watching as she disappeared into the crowd. And for the first time in a long time, he realized he wasn't just intrigued. He was hooked. Leon Hawthorne was not a man who let distractions cloud his focus. Yet the following days found him restless, his mind circling back to Rowan Sinclair at the most inconvenient moments. Meetings blurred together, business negotiations carried on as usual, but there was an undercurrent of something different, a pull he couldn't quite ignore. He wasn't used to seeking people out. But when he wanted something, he never hesitated. So when an opportunity presented itself, he took it. The gala was a high-profile charity event, one that Leon typically attended out of obligation rather than genuine interest. But this time, he had a reason to be there. He had done his research. Rowan would be attending, and unlike their previous encounters, this time he wouldn't let her walk away so easily. The venue was a sprawling estate, the kind that reeked of old money and carefully curated exclusivity. The moment he stepped inside, he scanned the crowd with practiced ease, his sharp gaze seeking out the one person who had managed to unsettle him. And then he saw her. Rowan stood near the garden terrace, engaged in conversation with a group of guests. She moved with effortless grace, her laughter light yet unguarded, as if she belonged in this world but wasn't consumed by it. The emerald gown she wore was different from the one he had seen her in before. This one was softer, flowing, accentuating her without demanding attention. Leon had spent years surrounded by people who thrived on power, on wealth, on status. Rowan was none of those things, yet she commanded his attention in a way no one else had. He approached without hesitation. She noticed him before he spoke, her gaze flickering with recognition but not surprise. "You again," she said, her voice carrying a teasing edge. Leon inclined his head slightly. "You don't seem shocked." "I'm not." She tilted her head, studying him. "You don't strike me as someone who leaves things unfinished. Interesting." She understood more about him than most people did in a lifetime. "I wanted to see you again," he admitted, his voice measured but firm. Rowan arched a brow. "And you're used to getting what you want." He didn't bother denying it. "Usually." She exhaled as if weighing his words. Then, instead of retreating, she gestured toward the garden. "Walk with me." Leon wasn't one to indulge in casual strolls, but for her, he made an exception. They moved through the manicured pathways, the distant chatter of the gala fading behind them. The air was crisp, scented with late-blooming flowers, and for the first time in what felt like years, Leon wasn't thinking about the next deal, the next acquisition, the next power move. "I looked into your nonprofit," he said after a moment. Rowan cast him a sidelong glance. "Did you? You've built something impressive." She paused near a stone fountain, tracing her fingers lightly over the cool marble edge. "Why do I get the feeling you don't hand out compliments often?" "Because I don't." That made her smile, not in amusement, but as if she understood the weight of his honesty. He took a step closer, closing the space between them. "You're different from anyone I've met." Rowan didn't shy away from his gaze. "And that intrigues you?" "Yes," she exhaled softly, looking up at him. "Leon, I don't live in your world." He already knew that, and yet he couldn't bring himself to care. "I don't need you to," he said simply. "I just need to know if you're willing to let me into yours." Something flickered in her expression, hesitation, curiosity, something unspoken. Then in a quiet voice she said, "I don't know." Leon Hawthorne was used to certainty, to definitive answers, but for the first time in a long time he found himself willing to wait. Leon Hawthorne had built an empire on decisiveness. Hesitation was a foreign concept to him, and yet Rowan Sinclair had introduced an unfamiliar element into his life: uncertainty. It wasn't doubt about what he wanted, he knew that with absolute clarity. It was the rare realization that, for once, he wasn't the one dictating the course of events. The memory of their conversation in the garden lingered in his mind long after the gala ended. She hadn't given him a definitive answer, but she hadn't walked away either. That alone was enough to fuel his resolve. 2 days later, he arrived at her nonprofit's headquarters unannounced. The building was modest but efficient, the kind of place where real work happened rather than just performative charity. He strode through the entrance, his presence commanding attention from the staff moving through the space. A young woman at the front desk blinked up at him in surprise. "Mr. Hawthorne, I'm here to see Rowan Sinclair." The receptionist hesitated but nodded. "She's in a meeting, but I'll wait." Leon was not a man accustomed to waiting, but for her, he would make an exception. He took a seat in the small waiting area, his sharp gaze scanning the space. Photographs lined the walls, each one showcasing the impact of the organization's smiling families, children holding books, communities rebuilding. Rowan had built something meaningful, something tangible. Minutes later, a door down the hall opened, and Rowan stepped out, speaking to a colleague. She hadn't noticed him yet, her focus entirely on the conversation. But when she glanced toward the waiting area and saw him, her steps faltered for the briefest second before she composed herself and approached. "You're full of surprises," she said, stopping in front of him. "You didn't give me an answer," he replied, She crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "So you decided to track me down at work. I believe in persistence." A flicker of something passed through her eyes, exasperation, amusement, something softer beneath the surface. "Come with me." She led him through the hallway to a small conference room. The moment the door closed behind them, she turned to face him. "You really don't give up, do you?" "No," he admitted. "Not when something matters." Her lips parted slightly, as if his words had caught her off guard. For a long moment, she simply studied him, as though trying to decipher his intentions. "Leon, I meant what I said," she finally murmured. "Our worlds are very different." "I don't care about that." She let out a slow breath. "I do." He stepped closer, reducing the space between them. "Then tell me this, do you feel something when you're with me?" Her throat bobbed slightly, her eyes searching his. He could see at the war inside her, the push and pull of logic versus desire, and then, finally, she whispered, "Yes." That was all he needed to hear. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Then let's stop pretending this is something we can ignore." For the first time since he had met her, Rowan didn't argue. Instead, she exhaled softly and squeezed his hand in return. Leon Hawthorne had never been a man who waited for fate to decide his path. And with Rowan Sinclair, he had no intention of letting her slip away. Leon Hawthorne had always been a man of action, and now that Rowan Sinclair had admitted there was something between them, he wasn't about to let her retreat behind uncertainty. The moment she squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgement of what existed between them, he made a decision. This was no longer a game of intrigue. He wanted her in his life, and he would prove to her that whatever differences lay between them weren't obstacles. They were simply contrasts that would make their connection stronger. Releasing her hand, he took a measured step back, giving her the space she seemed to need. "Have dinner with me," he said, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. It wasn't a question, it was a certainty. She hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of the conference table as if grounding herself. "Leon, no excuses," he cut in smoothly, "no overthinking. Just one night, let's see where this goes." She searched his face as if weighing the risk of saying yes. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded. "Fine." One dinner? That was all he needed. Leon didn't do casual. He didn't believe in half measures, especially not when it came to something or someone he wanted. So when Rowan agreed to dinner, he made sure it would be something unforgettable. That evening, a sleek black car pulled up in front of her modest apartment building, the driver stepping out to open the door. Rowan, dressed in a deep burgundy dress that hugged her in all the right places without being ostentatious, hesitated for only a moment before slipping into the back seat. Leon was already inside, waiting. His gaze swept over her, a quiet appreciation in the way his eyes lingered. "You look incredible." She gave him a look, half amused, half wary. "Is this where you tell me we're going to some private island?" "No," he said with a low chuckle, "not tonight." The car pulled away from the curb, gliding smoothly through the city. Rowan glanced out the window, her brow furrowing slightly as she took in the route. "This isn't heading toward any restaurant I know of." "That's because we're not going to a restaurant." She turned to him, curiosity flickering in her expression. "Then where are we going?" "You'll see." 15 minutes later, the car pulled up in front of a grand building with towering glass windows reflecting the evening skyline. It wasn't a restaurant, nor was it anything she had expected. Rowan stepped out, glancing up at the towering structure. "Leon." He placed a hand at the small of her back, guiding her inside. "Trust me." The moment they stepped through the entrance, the sound of a live orchestra filled the air, the delicate notes of a violin weaving through the space. The atrium opened up into a breathtaking private dining hall set atop one of the highest skyscrapers in the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows surrounded them, showcasing a panoramic view of the city lights stretching endlessly below. A single table sat in the center, draped in crisp white linen, illuminated by the soft flicker of candlelight. It was intimate, elegant, and completely secluded. Rowan exhaled, shaking her head in disbelief. "Leon, this is exactly what you deserve," he said simply. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You don't do things halfway, do you?" "I don't see the point in settling for less," he replied. A waiter appeared, discreetly pulling out a chair for her. Rowan hesitated for only a moment before sitting. Leon took the seat across from her, his gaze never leaving hers. As the courses arrived, each more exquisite than the last, Rowan finally leaned back, watching him with something between admiration and exasperation. "You're impossible, you know that," he raised a brow, "because I'm giving you a proper dinner. Because you make it very hard to keep my guard up." A slow smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Good," she shook her head, picking up her wine glass. "This isn't what I expected when I met you." "And what did you expect?" She considered that for a moment. "I don't know." "Someone untouchable, someone so consumed by power that they didn't care about anything else." Leon set his glass down, his fingers grazing the stem. "And now," she exhaled, her voice softer now. "Now I don't know what to think." He leaned forward, his eyes dark and intent. "Then let me make it clear I don't play games, Rowan. When I want something, I pursue it." "And I want you." She swallowed hard, her grip tightening slightly on the glass. "I'm not asking for forever," he continued. "I'm asking for a chance. A chance to show you that this isn't just some passing interest." Rowan's expression wavered, as if she were standing on the precipice of something terrifying and thrilling all at once. Then, slowly, she set her glass down and met his gaze head-on. Okay, Leon Hawthorne wasn't a man used to uncertainty. But for the first time in his life, he realized that the best things weren't always predictable. And Rowan Sinclair was proving to be the best thing that had ever happened to him. Rowan hadn't expected her world to shift so quickly, but with Leon Hawthorne, everything moved with an undeniable force. Their dinner had been more than a gesture, it had been a statement. He wanted her in his life, and he wasn't the kind of man to back down. In the days that followed, she found herself slipping into his orbit in ways she never thought possible. He didn't just make time for her, he made her a priority. Private drivers arrived to take her to meetings when she was running late. Her favorite coffee appeared at her desk without her mentioning it. And somehow, he always knew exactly when to reach out, as if he could sense when she was overwhelmed. But it wasn't just the grand gestures that unsettled her, it was the man behind them. Leon wasn't the untouchable tycoon the world believed him to be. Beneath the perfectly controlled exterior was someone who listened, who noticed the smallest details, who cared in ways she hadn't expected. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at the nonprofit, Rowan stepped into her apartment to find a single envelope on her counter. No extravagant gifts, no over-the-top displays, just her name written in bold, precise handwriting. She opened it to find a note. "Meet me on the rooftop at 8. Her heart skipped. She knew exactly which rooftop he meant. An hour later, she stepped onto the private terrace of his penthouse, the city stretching out endlessly below. Leon stood near the edge, hands tucked into his pockets, the glow of the skyline casting sharp lines along his face. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, turning to her. Rowan crossed her arms, watching him carefully. "You knew I would." A slow exhale left him, as if her presence was a relief he hadn't realized he needed. "I didn't want to pull you into my world if you weren't ready." She stepped closer, the cool night air wrapping around her. "And if I tell you I'm still figuring that out?" Leon reached out, brushing his fingers along hers, a touch so subtle it sent warmth rushing through her. "Then I'll wait." Rowan wanted to resist, to remind herself that they came from different worlds, that his life was a whirlwind of power and influence while hers was built on something simpler, something grounded. But standing there with the city below and Leon in front of her, none of that seemed to matter. "I don't need grand gestures," she murmured. "I know," he said quietly. But I need you to know that this isn't temporary for me. The weight of his words settled between them. This wasn't a fleeting attraction or a passing interest. Leon Hawthorne didn't do temporary. Rowan looked up at him, her heart pounding. Then stop waiting. Leon didn't hesitate. He closed the distance between them, his hand cupping her face as he leaned in. The moment his lips met hers, everything else faded. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a promise, a declaration, a breaking down of every wall that had once stood between them. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his breath uneven. "Come away with me," he murmured. Rowan opened her eyes, searching his. "Where?" "Anywhere," he said. "Everywhere," she laughed softly, shaking her head. "You don't do things halfway, do you? Not when it comes to you." And in that moment, she knew this wasn't just a risk worth taking. This was the beginning of something she never saw coming, something bigger than either of them, something real. 1 year later. The estate was bathed in golden sunlight, the rolling hills stretching endlessly beyond the grand terrace. Rowan stood near the balcony, the lace of her wedding dress fluttering in the breeze as she looked out over the vineyard. She still couldn't believe how much had changed in a year. Leon had shown her that love wasn't about grand displays or extravagant gifts, it was about showing up every day in ways that mattered. He had become a part of her world as much as she had become part of his. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and she leaned into the warmth of his embrace. "Nervous," Leon murmured against her ear. She smiled, tilting her head back to look at him. Not even a little. His lips pressed a soft kiss to her temple. "Good. Because this is forever." Rowan turned in his arms, cupping his face. "I wouldn't have it any other way." And as he kissed her again, with the sun setting behind them and the vineyard stretching before them, she knew this was exactly where she was meant to be. With him, always.